This is the conclusion to a long-standing mystery that has been slowly unraveling on my channel since, well, before I started my channel. I have covered the story of the wreck of the SS Atlantic in 1873 extensively. This is not a retelling of that. If you want to hear it, check out my 2023 documentary that tells the full story. But in my 6.5 years of studying this ship, there's been one tale that stands out above the rest for me, probably because it has one big unanswered question. Lauriston and Lillian Davidson, a mother and daughter traveling aboard the Atlantic and were lost in the sinking. Their grave exists, but where in the world is it? That's what we've been wondering on this channel since the beginning. Well, I've finally found it. This is the story of finding their grave, putting an end to my 6.5 years of searching. In the year 1872, Lauriston Davidson was recently widowed and living in Islington, London with her 17-year-old daughter, Lillian. She had had 4 different children, but Lillian was the only one to make it to this age. Lauriston's late husband was a sea captain and left the family enough resources to remain financially stable for a little while, but it didn't last. On top of that, Lillian had recently fallen ill, likely with tuberculosis. Doctors recommended that she move to a drier climate to improve her condition, and with no reason to stay in England, the two of them decided to pack up and move to the New World. Lauriston's brother, John Umphelby, who was working on one of the ranches in Telegraph City, California, invited his sister and niece to come stay with him in the sunny, dry climate of the American West. Lauriston booked first-class passage for her and her daughter on one of the most advanced and luxurious ships in the 1870s, the White Star liner SS Atlantic, departing Liverpool, England on March 20th, 1873. John secured a place for his sister and niece to stay in town and to get them established in the United States, likely even securing them a job on the ranch, temporarily at least. After all, Lauriston would be useful on a ranch, as John and Lauriston grew up on a farm together, a farm that Lauriston was actually named after. The plan was that once the SS Atlantic arrived in New Jersey, the mother and daughter would board a train with the Erie Railroad and make their way across the continent. However, a series of miscommunications aboard the SS Atlantic led the captain to believe that they were low on coal after sailing against a storm for several days, and he diverted the ship to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they would resupply. The ship approached Nova Scotia in the early hours of April 1st, when the stubborn officer on watch refused to wake the sleeping captain as directed, believing that he was capable of bringing the ship in on his own. His overconfidence doomed their vessel, unfortunately. The ship was off course and rammed hard into the rocky shore west of Halifax. The lights went out, the ship beached, and was pounded by the raging sea. The Davidson women were likely asleep at the time, being thrown from their beds by the impact and scrambling in the darkness to dress and grab their belongings. As the ship groaned and heaved, slowly settling back into the sea, the two women felt around in the darkness, grabbing what they could of their valuables and putting on warmer clothes. The darkness slowed them down, and within only a few moments the icy sea came flooding into their cabin, the ship rolling onto its side and taking the Davidsons down with it. The sinking of the SS Atlantic was one of the worst disasters of the North Atlantic in the 1800s, and the worst wreck for the White Star Line until the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. Divers were brought to the wreck site in Nova Scotia, working for weeks on end to recover the victims and anything of value from the destroyed liner. It was at 2 a.m. in the morning, on April 11th, that their bodies were found, still in their cabin, and recovered 10 days after the ship sank. For several more days, their bodies sat exposed to the elements on a hillside, on the nearby island where they were documented and collected until ready to be moved elsewhere. This hill became known as the Hill of the Dead, and although it was protected by armed guards, some scavenging did occur. There's a particular story in one of the newspapers about young men who were sightseeing at the wreck, collecting blonde hair from the body of a young woman who they found particularly beautiful. Now, Lillian was blonde, and survivors who recall seeing her during the voyage commented on how beautiful she was. Chances are, it was her that the hair was being removed from. The personal effects taken off of the bodies of the Davidsons included a letter, a banknote for $800, a Bible, and 2 silver spoons. These items were forwarded to relatives and eventually made their way back to family in Australia. Accompanying these items was this photograph of their grave. They share a headstone, with a handwritten note on the back of the image saying that it's believed to be in Halifax. Alright, well then where? Most resources online and newspaper accounts published right after the sinking say that the bodies were taken to Halifax and buried in the town's main cemetery, Camp Hill Cemetery. It was a bit odd that they would get special treatment over the other bodies recovered from the wreck, which were mostly put into 2 mass graves. Now, it wasn't because they were in saloon class, or first class. There were other bodies in first class that were in those graves. And it wasn't because they were identified. There were other bodies that were identified in those graves too. It wouldn't be completely bizarre that they're buried here. The graveyard does contain at least 2 other bodies from the sinking, Purser Ambrose Worthington and Second Officer Henry Metcalf. These men were the highest ranked casualties in the ship's crew, and they were both found and identified. They were buried side by side in the first row of Camp Hill Cemetery, closest to the street. The funerals were large, attendance including Atlantic surviving officers, local dignitaries, and representatives of all major shipping companies with a presence in Nova Scotia, including the Cunard and Allen lines. Metcalf's headstone has since vanished, but Worthington's still stands today. So where could they be in Camp Hill? Well, back in 2017, I met up with Deanna Ryan Meister, a friend of mine and president of the Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada, which also frequently works on projects related to the SS Atlantic. And we spent hours in this cemetery reading every headstone. We had the photograph with us. Of course, things will have changed over time, but we were trying to see what in the background might give us clues. There's a fence on the right-hand side, and what appears to be a roof and chimney behind it. So the stone should be somewhere near the cemetery boundary. Well, we checked everywhere, but with special emphasis on the outlying areas. Well, next we checked with people who worked at the cemetery and went through their files, and we found no record of the Davidsons ever being buried there. It looks like somewhere along the way, someone reported something false. Around this time, a fundraiser was being led by an American group called Shrouded Veterans to put a headstone on the unmarked grave of another SS Atlantic hero, Reverend William Ancient. Ancient was a local clergyman when the ship wrecked. He arrived late to the scene and found nearly 550 people already rescued from the ship, but there were 2 more people trapped in the ship's rigging offshore, including the ship's first officer. The seas were so rough and the ship was too unstable, so the rescuers had left them for dead. But Ancient insisted on giving it one last go, rowing a boat crew out to the wreck and pulling them off. He also oversaw the burial of the Protestant mass grave. Our audience here on Part-Time Explorer actually contributed quite a bit to this effort, helping them reach their goal. And in 2022, Shrouded Veterans placed a beautiful marker on this grave, commemorating his heroism. So I reached out to Frank, the guy who runs Shrouded Veterans. They specialize in finding unmarked graves in foreign countries, usually American veterans and servicemen who were killed in action and buried overseas without a headstone. And then they coordinate and raise funds and put a stone on that grave. Now, usually it's American veterans, and Reverend Ancient, a British-born Canadian, was an exception to that rule because he was so moved by his story. But I contacted him and asked for his help finding the Davidsons. Now, he encountered most of the same dead ends that I did, but he found one very interesting piece of evidence. It was an article dated after the announcement that the Davidsons were buried in Camp Hill, that the bodies of the 2 women had been taken to Halifax and were waiting to be claimed and shipped to relatives elsewhere for burial. At this point, I felt this pretty firmly ruled out Camp Hill as the burial location, but it didn't help narrow anywhere else down. My Atlantic projects were getting a good bit of attention, and I had already published quite a bit about the mystery of the Davidson graves. And that mystery had captivated a few more people as well. I had been contacted by a few viewers suggesting that perhaps the bodies had continued their intended journey, being shipped out to the brother in Telegraph City for burial. I saw Lauriston's probate, and it said that the estate was indeed being handled by her brother in Telegraph City, so he was definitely involved in settling her affairs. Now back to the photo. If you look at the foliage in the background of the grave, some of it certainly looks less like Nova Scotia and more like the American West Coast. Well, after some time, my work took me to California, and I was going to be driving by within 2 hours of Telegraph City, so I made a point of taking a detour. Telegraph City today is a complete ghost town. Little more than ruins on the side of the road. This would be an exciting visit no matter what I found, as my channel also covers ghost towns, and telling the story of Telegraph City's history would be a fun challenge anyway. So in mid-2022, that's where I went with my wife. We were well off the beaten path here. The only sounds were those of crows, the desert insects, and the squealing of a lone, rusty windmill still slowly pumping water into an abandoned cow trough. This lonely, quiet roll in the California countryside was once a bustling mining and ranching community of nearly 200 people. John Umphelby worked somewhere around here as a ranch hand, perhaps in one of the few remaining ruined structures still standing. In the immediate area around Telegraph City, there are 3 known cemeteries. One had only 1 headstone, and the other 2 had a couple. But them being private family graveyards, it was easy to cross them off the list. In 1899, Lauriston's brother John died in the nearby town of Eugene, only a couple miles to the southwest. The logical place for him to be buried is in Eugene's cemetery, the St. Joseph Cemetery. Perhaps we can find his grave there and maybe they'd be buried nearby. St. Joseph's Cemetery was a sparse, wind-swept graveyard, a contrast of old, faded headstones and ones as recent as only a few years ago. Many of the graves indicated the end of a very long journey. People born overseas who picked up their roots and migrated several times. You can actually see that this is the base of an old wooden cross, similar to the ones that we see in those corners over there. But he wasn't there. We tried the large cemetery in nearby Farmington. Although we knew it was only a slim chance that the graves would be there, it was worth checking out since this was the largest cemetery in the area, but still no luck. Well, that's it. Unless their stone was gone, they weren't there. I had hit a dead end. Now, it's possible that their bodies were taken to Australia or New Zealand, where they had relatives. It's also possible that they were taken back to England, where they had been living for the previous few years. And it's quite possible they were somewhere else entirely. I had nowhere else to look, and the trail kind of fizzled here for quite some time. Months went by, and in mid-2023, I was back in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I had just published my 150th anniversary documentary on the wreck of the SS Atlantic, and somehow in my sleep, I was still thinking about it. And I felt this special emphasis that I should check Camp Hill Cemetery one more time. And if they were there, they shouldn't be too far away from Ambrose Worthington's grave, because they were buried around the same time. The next day, almost feeling certain that I was going to find them, I went to the graveyard. In fact, I was so absolutely confident that I would be finding them that day that I preemptively bought flowers to put on their grave. Well, within half a minute, there it was. I looked right over there. It was the first stone I looked at, and the word Lillian actually is what caught my eye first. I'm like, okay, well, common enough name. And then I saw that it says died April 1st, 1870 something. Okay, that's a pretty big coincidence, because I wasn't even thinking this could possibly be it. We searched this place so many times in the past few years. And not just us, but several people whose interests have been piqued by this mystery. And now the stones seem to stand out. It's honestly funny that we searched here to begin with, and then went all the way across the continent to try to find them, only for it to have been where the newspapers said it was this whole time. But here it is, in the second row of Camp Hill Cemetery, within sight of Ambrose Worthington and Henry Metcalf. And it's not a bad spot. It's got a beautiful little flowering tree behind it. It actually has a lone daisy, I think that's a daisy, growing at the foot of it. It's moss covered. I wouldn't be able to make out half of what this stone said if I didn't have the historical photograph to look on. It's in a cluster of 4 similar headstones, the other 3 of which are all from the Bigby family, which makes me think that when the Davidsons' bodies were abandoned, a local family donated a spot in their family burial plot. After 6.5 years of searching, by myself, by local historians such as Bob Chalk and Deanna Ryan Meister, and even by dozens, if not hundreds, of viewers of my Atlantic documentaries, it's finally been found.
Huh. Be darned.
Right?
Look at that. It's Lillian. I thought I had seen everything that there was to see about the Atlantic, but obviously not. And I know I've walked past this because I came down and I looked at every single headstone in this cemetery.
Right? Seeing something like this just goes to show that there's still stories to be told, even 150 years after. And it's something that everybody should really know about in the area. Just seeing this, it's like seeing an old friend, kind of. Like, you get to see the story of the way it was. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
I was told by the folks who administer this cemetery that this is the area where people who didn't necessarily have a plot purchased were buried. Most people in here actually own the plot, still like it today. But this is for people who just kind of showed up and needed a place to stay, I guess.
The walk-ins. Yeah.
So my book on the Atlantic is my 6th book. I've got a 7th one just out. The Atlantic book is called Atlantic's Last Stop, and it is published by Nimbus here in Halifax, and you can get it on most of the online stores, or certainly at any store in Halifax.
Without realizing it, their headstone even made a brief appearance in my earliest Atlantic documentary way back in 2018, when I first began the hunt for their graves. In that time, I had completely retraced their journeys, having stopped in Liverpool, England, where the ship departed from, having been to Queenstown, now called Cove, Ireland, where the ship briefly stopped, having traveled to Lower Prospect, where the ship wrecked, and then to Halifax, where the bodies were taken, and finally out to Telegraph City, California, completing the final leg of the journey that they would never finish. When I went to Telegraph City in remembrance of Lauriston and Lillian, I brought a couple of fragments from the wreck of the SS Atlantic that were in my collection. Now, these items had no direct connection to the 2 women. They never touched them. They were down in the cargo hold. But symbolically, at least something indirectly connected with their crossing has finally completed the journey. Putting the 1873 newspapers into the context of what is known now, we see that the bodies were taken from the site of the disaster and brought to Halifax with the intention that they would be claimed by relatives and shipped elsewhere for burial. As time went by, for unknown reasons, the plans changed, and they were placed in Camp Hill Cemetery in the vicinity of the other victims of the disaster. After all this time searching, I can finally call their mystery concluded, and the story of Lauriston Davidson and her daughter Lillian can finally be told to completion. Bringing things a little bit closer to home for me, I was surprised to find out from SS Atlantic historian and author Bob Chalk that there was a grave of an Atlantic survivor only a half hour from my family home in Pennsylvania. On the south side of North Cedar Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia is the grave of George White, who traveled aboard Atlantic and survived, continuing his journey to Philadelphia where he lived out his days. While he has no known connection to the Davidsons, it was an interesting coincidence to learn that there was a grave nearby only within a week of finding the Davidsons. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more content like this. Also consider checking out my Patreon or joining my YouTube memberships. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankert, Gabriel Colon, RGB, Tara Mulikar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Manti Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Frazier, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarky, Sam Forker, Busy Bee, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Bewick, Brian Reedy, and Eden Cleefish.